Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we've got another top 10 video, and our topic for the day is the top 10 things the Navy hates about battleships. So, a couple of disclaimers. These are my opinions. Obviously, I love battleships, but this is what I think some of the things that the Navy doesn't like about the battleships are that leads to them constantly being decommissioned. These aren't necessarily the views held by anyone in the Navy explicitly saying that. They're not the views of the museum. We all love battleships here. Also, if you guys like this video, in the future we might do one top 10 things the Navy loves about battleships, because these things get decommissioned all the time, but they're constantly being brought back into service. So obviously there's a couple of factions going on here. These are somewhat in order of what I think their importance is. Feel free to talk in the comments section about, I think that's more important, I think this is more important, or you missed this other thing. I'd love to hear your lists of things the Navy loves and hates about these ships and what order you'd put them in. So, in my number 10 spot at the bottom, battleships are the premier surface combat ships in the Navy. Great. There hasn't been any significant surface combat since 1944. We had battleships in 1944. Battleships participated in that battle. But the Navy has not operated in the way it traditionally did up till 1944 since World War II. There just hasn't been a peer adversary we've gone to war with. Anyone we've gone to war with has had nothing in the way of major surface combatants, and so any of our small, cheap vessels could deal with it. Battleships are designed to be the premier surface warfare asset. If we're not doing surface warfare anymore, we don't need battleships. In the number 9 spot, they are slow. This doesn't necessarily pertain to the Iowa class, but battleships in general are significantly slower because of their sheer size than any of the ships around them. And that might not be an issue when you're fighting surface battles and two slow fleets of battleships can lumber into view of each other. But since World War II, it's been basically police actions where we have fewer ships than we would like, and we've got to send them scrambling all over the world from hotspot to hotspot. This is probably why the Iowa class survives as long as they do, because they do have the same high speed as the rest of the fleet. If somehow the Navy got the money to build a new battleship, it would probably be closer to a battle cruiser and have really high speed to get around the world. But why did most of the World War II era battleships get decommissioned when the Iowas are retained? It's a speed thing. In my number 8 spot, there are not enough room for missiles because of the guns. Battleship's whole reason for being is that it has these great guns, which are good in surface warfare, they're good in shore bombardment, and nothing else in the Navy has anything like that. So you don't want to remove those guns to drop in a bunch of missiles. Those guns take up valuable centerline space. A modern battleship may well see a design similar to the Zumwalt, with missiles around the perimeter instead of in vertical launch cells amidships, or it may not. Battleships are supposed to be armored, and the armor goes around the perimeter. So where do you put the missiles? And if those missiles get hit, is that going to defeat your armor? The Iowas only had room for 48 missiles, so like half as many as a modern destroyer. This limits their ability to do shore bombardment with Tomahawks. It limits their ability in a surface fight where you probably have to launch multiple missiles to take out an enemy ship. Missiles have a significantly greater range than the guns, so you're likely going to be expending them first. If you watch our video on the Iowa class versus the Kirov class, the Kirovs vastly outrange the Iowas in terms of missile numbers and missile range. So it's likely they're going to do damage first. And that may well end the engagement. The American ship that's been damaged might well turn around and go home. So there's a link to that in the comment section down below. With an older battleship, you just can't retrofit enough missiles on for modern combat. And for a brand new built battleship, you would end up with some sort of Frankenstein In my number 7 spot, there are just too few of them, and you lose too much if one is lost. We've got 10 to a dozen aircraft carriers at any given time in the Navy, but we've only got a single class of battleships in the modern Navy, the Iowa class, that keeps getting recalled. If one of them is lost, you've then lost a quarter of your battleship fleet. So you're putting a lot of eggs in one basket, not just in terms of the battleship, but also in terms of the manpower it takes to operate one of these. And we're going to talk about manpower a little bit later, higher up the list. But battleships require specialized skills that don't exist anywhere else in the Navy. And if one of these catastrophically goes down, you potentially lose 1/4 of the individuals who know that skill set. Whether that is the steam propulsion plant or the 16-inch guns or even the antiquated 5-inch guns, you've got to now train new people to use those on your other ships. Or let's say we bring in a modern Navy ship and we put rail guns and lasers on it, or whatever else the Navy's been researching that people talk about for a modern battleship. Now you've lost 1/4 of the people who know how to use rail guns because the rest of the ships in the fleet are still using conventional armament. And so it is a huge investment, which is best utilized by putting it in harm's way. That is the job that a battleship does that another modern ship cannot. So there is a significant risk of losing it. The long lead time in building. Now, the 3 years it took to build New Jersey is nothing compared to a modern aircraft carrier, and it's favorable even compared to a modern frigate or destroyer. However, if we're talking about building a new battleship as opposed to reactivating an old one, just triple that. It takes way longer to build a ship nowadays than it did back then. Reactivating one of these ships, you could probably do it in a year. It's been done before. Building a whole new one, you've got to rebuild your infrastructure to do it. You've got to upscale your gun manufacturing to be able to make something the right size, or develop the rail guns you're going to use, which the Navy has cut the budget for, or you've got to make new armor plating for it, and the armor for these ships would be significantly greater than that of any other ship in the Navy. So you've got to build up an entire infrastructure around building these ships and then supporting them once they're in the fleet. And that might make sense if you're planning on having a whole multi-generational thing with classes building off of each other and dozens of them in service. It might not make sense if you authorize 2 or 3 of them, like the Navy did with the Zumwalts. So there would be a long lead time in building a new one, less so for reactivating one, but you're really limited in what you can do in reactivating one. In my number 5 spot, we're in the middle of the list right now, battleships are too big to be stealthy. Being stealthy sort of eliminates their main goal. A battleship is a power projection asset that you can sail into an enemy harbor with supposed impunity. But the modern Navy is very much going towards stealthier assets. If you can't find it, then you can't shoot it. Our main adversaries, who are the closest to peer competitors to the U.S. Navy, cannot match us ship for ship, but they can exceed our capabilities with long-range anti-ship missiles. So the best way to avoid that is to never be seen. No matter how good your defenses are, something can always get through. So having a big lumbering battleship that everybody can see coming causes some issues. Now, the Iowa class did have some success in the 1980s during war games, sneaking up on fleets of ships. Missouri pretty famously was able to sneak up on a carrier battle group. Quite honestly, I'm not sure how she did that. The radar return off of a battleship is about the size of a battleship, whereas the radar return off of a Zumwalt is the size of a fishing trawler. One of the things they did was turn off all their electronics transmitting stuff, and they were in pretty rough weather and fog, so they couldn't be detected by air assets or satellites. I have no idea how they were not detected by radar. I assume the fleet they were hunting was also trying to be stealthy with their electronics. But there's a certain amount of relying on the weather there that you might not always be able to do. So you can't make a stealthy battleship, and you should really feel bad if you're caught unawares by a battleship. In the number 4 spot, they are old. Maybe this one should have gone higher on the list, but assuming we're talking about what's feasible and reactivating an older ship as opposed to building a whole new class of ships, the Iowas are ridiculously old. Sure. They've only got a few steaming miles on them. New Jersey herself has the most with 22 years of service, which is still within the range of a modern capital ship at 40 to 50 years with frequent upgrades. Wisconsin only has 12 years of service. She's practically brand new. However, there's still a lot of wear and tear associated with that age. For one, the equipment is 80 years old, so it's largely obsolete, and you can spend a lot of money to replace it. But then things like the plumbing systems are ridiculously old and obsolete. Not so much obsolete, but the battleship is made out of armor plating, and that stuff resists corrosion. It's got a pretty high purity. It will last a long time. The deck drain system is still regular mild steel. You can't paint the inside of it or chip rust off the inside of it, so it corrodes from the inside out where the water's hitting it. And so these ships just spring leaks all the time. And the overpressure from firing the guns only exacerbates that problem and shakes the pipes and causes more leaks. So reactivating one of these ships, a quarter of the crew would be hull technicians, ship fitters, those sorts of people, just chasing the plumbing problems, which is doable if there's a national emergency and we're talking about bringing back the Iowas. It's probably the least of our worries. But the age of these ships all but guarantees their obsolescence. In my number 3 slot, underwater protection. In theory, the belt armor of the battleship means that it can take a hit and shrug it off with virtually no damage, if the belt is hit. Hits to the superstructure that's unarmored may damage some of the capacity of the ship, but it can be relatively easily fixed. Hits to the underwater part of the ship severely endanger the vessel. Iowa-class battleships have a 22-foot deep torpedo defense system, which is among the most effective ever put to sea on a battleship. However, modern torpedoes and mines are designed to defeat that. They've got large enough warheads to go through it. They're designed to explode under the ship and break the keel as opposed to punching several holes in the side. And even if that doesn't work and it just punches a big hole in the side of the ship, maybe that doesn't threaten the ship, maybe the ship doesn't sink, but you've still achieved a mission kill. This ship can no longer perform the mission it was designed to do. It has to go back to port for costly repairs, and it's going to be much slower doing it because it's now got a big hole in it and a bunch of extra weight from that water. So no matter how much armor plate you have, battleships have always been vulnerable to underwater damage, and that has always done a disproportionate amount of damage. So your premier surface warfare platform and force projection platform can be easily damaged and sent back home by something as cheap and simple as an underwater mine in the harbor that they're trying to operate in, or a cheap diesel electric submarine. And battleships have no defense against that. All they can do is take the hit, and then they've got to live with the consequences. So underwater protection comes in at number 3. In the number 2 spot, limited range of weapons. Something like 40% of the Earth's population lives within, 50 miles of the coast. So Iowa-class battleships' guns have a range of about 23 land miles, about 20 nautical miles. They can engage a significant amount of the world's population, a significant amount of the world's factories. This stuff falls within their range. But not all of it. Their range is very limited. With modern invasion tactics, we can fly the better part of our invasion force right over the enemy beaches, far inland, and start attacking major cities. Means that they could outrange the battleship's guns in relatively short order. During World War II, the battleships did bombard Japan and destroyed a number of Japanese factories. Japan has a lot of coastline. A lot of our potential enemies do if we're fighting a peer-on-peer war. China has a lot of coastline. Russia has a lot of coastline. But they also have a lot of depth to them, and a significant proportion of their factories are inland. So the range of the Iowa-class weapons may make them very effective for a short period of time, and then they are relatively useless. Missiles extend that, but we've already talked about how they have limited capacity for carrying cruise missiles, especially compared to more modern vessels. And when I make my list of the top 10 positives of a ship, I will certainly talk about how shells are much cheaper than missiles. Well, that's all well and good, but the shells have 1/10 or 1/100th of the range of a missile, depending on how good that missile is. So it limits their use in both surface warfare and what battleships have been used for more traditionally, since we don't fight surface warfare battles anymore. So just limited use. And again, when battleships are used is when the enemy controls their own coastline early in a war, when they've still got all of these big missiles and minefields and submarines and things, and we haven't destroyed them all yet. So your battleship may well be defeated before it ever manages to get within range of its guns. And finally, in my number one spot, the cost of manning and operating these ships. We've already talked about building a new one is going to be a costly proposition for a limited number of platforms. We've already briefly mentioned that manning these ships is a costly proposition. If you're just bringing back an older one, manning it and keeping it going is going to be super expensive. And this is especially an issue in the modern military, where we have an all-volunteer fighting force. A significant proportion of your volunteers need to go into this ship to man guns and engines. And these guns and engines are obsolete, so they're not learning the skills that they need to go into the workforce after they leave the Navy. So in the modern Navy, certain ratings on these ships were basically trapped on the battleships. And for battleship lovers like me, that sounds like a dream. If you are a gunner's mate, you've learned how to use the 60-inch guns on these ships, you're just going to be rotated from Iowa-class battleship to Iowa-class battleship. And we see that a lot in the 80s. We have a number of veterans who reach out to us and they say, oh, I served on both Wisconsin and Iowa in the 80s, or all of these ships. And it seems to be engineering and gunnery ratings that are particularly there. Damage controlmen can go to any other ship and use those skills. A cook can go to any other ship and use those skills. But there aren't any other ships that have gunners mates. So you've got to train these people to specifically do that job. And then you've got to either keep them in that line of work or spend money training them again when they come out. And before they leave the Navy, you probably want to train them yet again to be able to contribute to a civilian workforce. So there is a huge cost of manning these vessels. We have seen a trend in the modern Navy to try and build less manpower intensive vessels like the littoral combat ships, and that proved to be ineffective. You can't just do the maintenance in port. You have to have a large enough crew to do maintenance and damage control on the ship underway. So getting an Iowa-class battleship down to truly small manpower levels will never happen. You can certainly get it lower than the 1,600 men that were here on the 80s, and that doesn't really compare to the 6,000 guys on an aircraft carrier. However, aircraft carriers have skills that can be transferred. Aircraft carriers form a significant part of the fleet, and skills from aircraft carriers can be used on other ships in the fleet. So those are some of my thoughts on why the Navy doesn't like Iowa-class battleships. We've done a couple of videos in the past about why the battleships won't be brought back again. There's a link to at least one in the description below. Feel free to peruse our channel for some other thoughts on this. I would love to hear your thoughts. Which ideas did I get right? Which ones did I get wrong? Which ones did I miss? And we did end up talking more about the modern Navy, but a lot of these topics I could easily talk about in terms of the post-World War II Navy, why these ships get decommissioned so quickly. And maybe that's food for another future video. Anyway, love to hear from you in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State and also from a number of businesses and individuals like yourselves. We really appreciate the support you give us. There's a link in the description for ways you can continue to support us. Another way to support us is by liking, sharing, and subscribing so that more people hear about our channel and learn about what our museum is doing. We appreciate your support, and I'll see you next time.